Don't just stand there. Your husband upstairs with my wife. What I saw Nick made my blood boil. Hi, welcome to Family Revenge. Thanks for being here. Enjoy my new story.
I stood in the middle of a lavish charity fundraising party, stunned into shock, as I watched my husband kiss a violinist in a secluded corner near the main hall. Before I could scream, a stranger blocked my path. His voice a deadly whisper. "Your husband is liquidating his assets. With my wife." Then he leaned closer and whispered 5 words I'll never forget. "Check the fish tank upstairs." 2 minutes later, I slipped away from the 400 guests, opened the door to the office, and discovered something that horrified me. "Thank you for staying. Out of everywhere you could be right now, you're here. That matters. Tell me where you're from, country, city, wherever home is. Let's fill the comments together." Quick note: this story weaves in fictional elements for entertainment and educational value. Similarities to any names or places are coincidental, but everything it's trying to say completely intentional. I have stood in many rooms in my life. Courtrooms where I researched my novels. Hospital waiting rooms where I sat with my first husband in his final months. Boardrooms where men in expensive suits pretended not to be impressed by a woman who outsold them all. I have learned over 65 years how to stand in a room and feel nothing on the outside, while everything on the inside moves like water behind glass. That is what I did on the night of November 16th. The Hargrove estate sat high above the city on Pacific Heights, the kind of San Francisco address that made people lower their voices when they said it. Sterling had rented the entire property for the evening, the ballroom, the garden terrace, the private dining rooms, all of it dressed in white orchids and candlelight, for the annual gala of the Whitmore Foundation, the charitable organization he had built and run for the past decade. 400 guests filled the space: politicians, tech executives, old money from Pacific Heights, and new money from Silicon Valley. The kind of people who wrote checks with too many zeros and called it generosity. I wore a midnight blue gown I had chosen carefully not to impress, but to disappear. To be the elegant, quiet wife in the background while my husband worked the room. That had been my role for 12 years, and I had grown comfortable in it, the way you grow comfortable in a coat that no longer quite fits. The violin performance had been the centerpiece of the evening. Her name, I would later learn, was Bianca Calloway. She was 31 years old, with dark hair swept back from her face, and a way of holding the bow that suggested she had been doing it since before she could read. She played Massenet's Méditation, a piece so achingly beautiful that I watched 3 grown men in the front row press their lips together to keep their composure. When she finished, the silence lasted exactly 2 seconds before the room erupted. Sterling was on his feet first. I noticed that. I always notice things like that now, though. I did not always used to. He stood before anyone else, clapping with the kind of enthusiasm that goes slightly beyond professional appreciation. He was smiling, not his business smile, which I know the way I know my own handwriting, but something softer, something private wearing a public face. I held my champagne glass and watched. The crowd began to shift the way crowds do at the end of a performance. People turning to their neighbors, reaching for their drinks, filling the air with the warm noise of approval. That movement, completely natural and entirely unremarkable, opened a small gap in the sea of bodies near the far pillar, one of the grand decorative columns that anchored the corners of the ballroom. Sterling moved toward Bianca. There was nothing unusual about that. He was the host. He would be expected to thank the performer. I told myself that as I watched him cross the floor, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked, a habit of his when he was pleased with himself. What happened next lasted perhaps 4 seconds. His fingers touched her wrist, not a handshake, not a pat on the arm, but the specific, unhurried touch of someone reaching for something familiar. She looked up at him. Not with gratitude, not with the polite brightness a performer gives a patron. She looked up at him the way a person looks at someone they have been waiting to see all evening. Then he leaned down and he kissed her. It was brief. It was quiet. It was in every practical sense invisible to the room. But I was standing at exactly the right angle with exactly the right years of paying attention, and I saw it as clearly as I have ever seen anything in my life. I did not gasp. I did not drop my glass. My hand did not shake. What I felt was not the sharp, wild pain I might have expected. It was something colder, and in its own way, worse, the specific sensation of a question you have been afraid to ask, finally answering itself. The kind of knowing that does not arrive like a storm, but like a fog, lifting. Slow and complete and irreversible. I had suspected. For months I had suspected. And some part of me, the part that still wanted to believe in the life I thought I had built, had worked very hard not to look directly at what I suspected. Now I had looked, and there was no going back from that. I lowered my champagne glass to the nearest table, slowly, deliberately. The crystal met the white linen without a sound. When I raised my eyes again, I found that I was not the only one watching. A man stood perhaps 6 feet from me, close enough that I wondered how I had not noticed him before. He was in his late 50s, I guessed, tall and composed in a charcoal suit that had not come off any rack. Silver at the temples, a glass of bourbon held loosely at his side. He was not looking at Sterling. He was not looking at Bianca. He was looking directly at me with an expression that was not curiosity, not pity, not surprise. It was recognition, as if he had been standing in this same room on the inside of this same moment and understood exactly what it felt like from where I was standing. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of nod that does not say hello or excuse me, but something far more specific. Now you know. I set my glass down on the table beside me. The party continued around us, laughter crystal, the low hum of 100 conversations, as if the world had not just quietly rearranged itself. I straightened my shoulders, and I walked toward the only person in that room who every instinct I had ever trusted told me was not pretending. Within 30 seconds, he was standing directly in front of me, bourbon in hand, voice low enough that only I could hear him above the noise of 400 people who had no idea what was happening 6 feet from the shrimp cocktail station. "You're steadier than I expected," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation delivered the way a doctor reads a chart, clinical, precise, without sentiment. "I've had practice," I said. He studied me for a moment, then extended his hand. "Julian Mercer. I'm Bianca's husband." I shook it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a man who understood that time was a limited resource and did not enjoy wasting it. I had written enough attorneys into my novels to recognize the type, the ones who said less than they knew and knew considerably more than they said. "Eleanor Whitmore," I replied, though of course he already knew that. "I know who you are," he confirmed. "I've known for about a month." He did not elaborate on that immediately, and I did not ask him to. Instead, I took a moment to look at him the way I used to look at everyone before Sterling gradually convinced me that paying too close attention to people was a symptom of professional paranoia rather than simple intelligence. Julian Mercer was somewhere in his late 50s, controlled posture, expensive watch worn without self-consciousness, eyes that moved in small, efficient patterns, not nervous, but cataloging. He was a man who had walked into difficult rooms before and expected to walk out of them. "You didn't come here tonight to enjoy the auction," I said. "No." He took a measured sip of his bourbon. "I came because this is the first time in 3 weeks that you've been in a room where Sterling isn't within arm's reach of you. I needed that window." There it was. The reason he had waited. Chosen his moment, positioned himself near me before the performance ended. I noted it, filed it, did not let it move my face. "Then use it," I said. He did. "Approximately 5 weeks ago," Julian began, his voice dropping another register, I discovered that my wife had been moving money, small amounts at first, the kind that don't trigger alerts if you know what you're doing. Then larger transfers, all of it flowing toward a set of accounts I didn't recognize. He paused. I'm a divorce attorney, Mrs. Whitmore. I have spent 23 years watching people hide assets from their spouses. I know exactly what that looks like. And you trace the accounts, I said. Eventually. It took time, and it took someone I trust completely. He did not specify who, and I did not press. The accounts trace back to Sterling. More precisely, to a private banking arrangement in Geneva. The plan, as best I can reconstruct it, is to have enough liquid capital moved offshore before the end of the year, so that when they disappear, there's nothing left to freeze. I heard the words. I processed them. And I felt the same cold, clarifying sensation I had felt 6 minutes earlier, watching my husband kiss another woman, not shock, but confirmation. Both of us, I said. It was not a question. Both of us, he confirmed. Your assets, mine, whatever they can access before they go. I looked at him steadily. Why are you telling me this? Because I can't move fast enough alone. His jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in the composure. Freezing accounts across international jurisdictions requires a legal filing from both affected parties. One spouse acting unilaterally raises challenges that two acting together do not. I need your cooperation, and I need it quickly. And there it was, the reason. Clean. Transactional. He was not here because he felt sorry for me. He was not here because he believed in justice, or because he wanted to protect a stranger. He was here because he needed something from me, and he had calculated that tonight was the best opportunity to ask for it. I had written 23 mystery novels. I understood that the person who delivers the truth is not always the person you would choose to deliver it, and their motives do not have to be pure for the information to be real. I also understood that a man can be simultaneously self-interested and correct. You could be lying, I said. I could be. He agreed without flinching. I'd be skeptical too in your position, so I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a small card plain with a number handwritten on the back. Call the number on the back tomorrow morning. It belongs to a forensic accountant I've worked with for 11 years. She's already reviewed the documents. She'll tell you everything I just told you, and she has no reason to do me any favors. I took the card, held it without looking at it. Then Julian Mercer said the thing that I have thought about every day since. Check the fish tank, Mrs. Whitmore, upstairs, under the sand. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down quiet, deliberate, finished. Then he straightened his jacket, picked up his bourbon, and walked back into the party as if he had done nothing more remarkable than comment on the canapés. I stood where he left me. The music had resumed, something light and forgettable drifting from the quartet near the terrace. Around me, San Francisco's finest continued their evening laughing, bidding, performing the rituals of wealth and generosity that kept events like this one alive. None of them looked my way. None of them had any idea. The fish tank. Sterling kept a saltwater aquarium in his upstairs study, a 6-foot custom installation that he treated with a devotion I had always found slightly disproportionate. He fed the fish himself every morning. He would not allow the housekeeper to clean near it. He had replaced the filtration system twice in the past year at considerable expense, insisting that only he understood its precise calibration. I had thought it was simply one of his things. Everyone has their things. I stood there in my midnight blue gown, the card pressed flat between two fingers, and let myself think for the first time without stopping myself about all the things I had chosen, over 12 years, not to look at too directly. I placed the card into my small evening clutch, and I was no longer sure it was about a fish tank at all. Before I tell you what happened next that evening, I need you to understand how I got there. Not in one night. Not from a single argument or a discovered text message or a lipstick shade that wasn't mine. 12 years is a long time to build something, and it is an equally long time to quietly, methodically take it apart one small piece at a time, in ways so subtle that the person being taken apart hardly notices until she is standing in a ballroom, holding a champagne glass, watching her husband kiss someone else, and realizing she is not even surprised. My first husband, Edward Hargrove, died in February of 2012 after a 14-month illness that I will not describe in detail because it belongs to him, not to this story. What I will say is that he was a good man, steady and decent, and not particularly exciting, which I say with genuine affection, because steady and decent are qualities that are grotesquely undervalued until you spend time around their absence. Robert left me two things: the estate on Pacific Heights and a trust worth $15 million. On the advice of my attorney at the time, a meticulous woman named Patricia Ellsworth, who had handled Robert's estate planning for 2 decades, I kept both assets titled exclusively in my name. Under California law, inherited assets are classified as separate property, meaning they belong solely to the person who inherits them. They cannot be divided in a divorce, provided they are never mixed with marital funds. Patricia was emphatic on this point. Maintain a separate account pay for separate expenses from separate funds, and never, under any circumstances, allow the lines to blur. I followed her advice to the letter. It seemed like common sense at the time. It turned out to be the most important decision I made in the 12 years that followed. I met Sterling Whitmore 8 months after Robert's funeral, at a benefit dinner for the San Francisco Symphony, the kind of event I attended because I had always attended it, and because sitting alone in a house where someone used to live is its own particular form of suffering. Sterling was charming in a way that felt at the time like warmth rather than performance. He ran the Whitmore Foundation, a charitable organization focused on arts education, and he spoke about it with what seemed like genuine conviction. He was 60 years old to my 53. He did not flirt. He listened. He remembered things I said in passing and referenced them weeks later. We married in the spring of 2013 quietly with a small ceremony at City Hall and dinner afterward for 16 people. The early years were by any reasonable measure good. Sterling never asked about my finances, never suggested I restructure the trust or add his name to any accounts, never expressed even mild curiosity about the details of Robert's estate. I interpreted this as integrity, as the behavior of a man who had built his own life and did not need anyone else's. I was not wrong about that precisely. I simply did not understand what he was actually building or how long he had been planning to build it. I had published 23 mystery novels before I met Sterling. My 24th came out the year we married. My 25th followed 18 months after that. Not my best work, I knew even then, but finished and out in the world and mine. Then things began to shift. It started with comments so gentle they barely registered as comments. "You were up until 2 in the morning again. You're going to wear yourself out." Or, "Your editor called while you were writing. I told her you needed space. I hope that was all right." Or, with genuine seeming concern while handing me a cup of coffee, "You seem tense when you're in the middle of a book. Is it worth it at this point in your life?" Each sentence taken alone was the kind of thing a caring spouse might say. Placed in sequence across months and then years, they were something else entirely. "You've earned the right to rest. Writing pulls you away from us. I miss you when you disappear into it. We don't need the money, Eleanor. You don't have to keep doing this." I stopped writing my 26th novel in the fall of 2019. I told myself it was a break. I told my publisher it was a sabbatical. I told Sterling it was his idea, and he smiled and said he just wanted me to be happy. By 2022, I had not opened a manuscript document in 3 years. I want to be precise about what happened because I think precision matters here, and because I have had a great deal of time since that November evening to examine it carefully. Sterling did not forbid me from writing. He did not destroy my work, or confiscate my computer or issue ultimatums. What he did was slower, and I now understand more deliberate he made me feel. Through years of accumulated suggestion that writing was a symptom of some restless dissatisfaction I needed to outgrow, that a woman of my age in a marriage like ours with a life like mine should not need to disappear into invented worlds anymore. He made me ashamed of the one thing that had always been entirely my own. The last time I opened my laptop to write was a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 2023. I had an idea, a small one, just the shape of a scene, the kind that used to pull me to the desk before I was fully awake. I sat down at the writing table in my study and opened a new document. Sterling appeared in the doorway 10 minutes later. He looked at the screen, then at me. Then he said with a slight, almost tender tilt of his head, "Are you doing that to yourself again?" I closed the laptop. I did not open it again for a very long time. Standing in that ballroom 16 months later, Julian Mercer's card pressed flat in my evening clutch, I finally let myself call that moment what it was. Not a kindness, not concern, a door closing. The summer after that Tuesday, Sterling installed security cameras throughout the house. The summer of 2024 arrived the way San Francisco summers always do, not with heat, but with a particular quality of light, pale gold and slightly diffuse, filtered through the marine layer that rolls in off the bay each morning and rarely burns off before noon. I remember it clearly because it was the summer I began to notice things I had trained myself for years not to notice. Sterling installed the cameras on a Tuesday in late June, 7 of them positioned throughout the house by a security company he had hired, without mentioning it to me until the technicians were already in the foyer. He presented it as a done thing, the way he sometimes did with decisions he anticipated I might question. "I should have done this years ago," he said, watching the lead technician mount a unit near the staircase landing. "A house like this in this neighborhood, we're a target, whether we think about it or not. We've lived here for 12 years without cameras," I said, "and we've been lucky for 12 years. He put a hand briefly on my arm. "Let me do this. It'll make me feel better." I did not argue. That was by then a well-established pattern between us. What I did do later that afternoon was walk through each room and observe exactly where the cameras had been placed. A security system designed to protect a home from intrusion positions its cameras at entry points, front door, back door, ground floor windows, garage. The cameras Sterling had installed were oriented differently. One covered the hallway outside my study. One pointed directly at the antique secretary desk where I kept my personal files, and one mounted high in the corner of the room we used as a shared office, had a clear sightline to the built-in safe behind the painting on the east wall. None of them faced a window or an exterior door. I stood in the middle of that office for a long moment looking at the small black lens angled toward the safe. And I felt something move through me, not quite alarm, more like a door somewhere in the back of my mind opening an inch. It had not opened before. Then I closed it. I was good at that. "He's worried about the art collection," I told myself. "The Hargrove pieces alone are worth more than most people's homes." I believed it, or I made myself believe it, which at the time felt like the same thing. 2 months later, Sterling took me to dinner at Bick's for my 65th birthday, a restaurant tucked into a Gold Rush-era alley in the financial district. All warm light and dark wood, and jazz from the live trio in the corner. He had reserved the best table. He ordered a bottle of Burgundy I recognized as expensive without knowing exactly how expensive, which I suspect was the intention. The gift came after dessert. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said, setting a slim navy box on the table between us. "Dr. Carmichael mentioned it back in the spring. Dr. Carmichael was Sterling's personal physician, a man I had met perhaps 4 times, whose practice catered to the kind of San Francisco clientele who expected same-day appointments and never sat in waiting rooms. In the months preceding my birthday, Sterling had arranged 2 separate consultations where Dr. Carmichael had in passing raised the subject of age-related hearing sensitivity. Nothing alarming, he had said both times. Simply something to be aware of. Simply something worth addressing proactively. I opened the box. Inside, nestled in white foam, was a hearing aid, not the beige plastic device of a previous generation, but a sleek, barely visible piece of technology small as a shirt button. Matte silver. "It's the most advanced one on the market," Sterling said. "Custom calibrated, you'll forget you're wearing it." I looked at it for a moment. "I didn't know I needed one," I said. "Dr. Carmichael thinks a little assistance would make a real difference in environments like this." He gestured at the restaurant, the jazz, the murmuring conversations, the ambient noise of a full room. "You've been asking people to repeat themselves more. I notice it even if you don't." I had no way to assess whether this was true. The fact that I could not easily contradict it was itself, I now understand, part of the design. "Thank you," I said. I wore it every day from that point forward. It was as advertised, barely noticeable. The headaches began sometime in September. Not severe, a low, persistent pressure behind my eyes that I associated with the transition from summer to fall with barometric changes, with 65 years of living in a body that was entitled to occasional complaints. I forgot appointments twice in 1 week, which I attributed to a busy schedule. I misplaced my reading glasses 3 times in 3 days, then found them in the refrigerator, which I attributed to distraction. I was, after all, 65 years old, in a complicated marriage in an expensive city, managing a household and a trust, and a social calendar built around someone else's professional ambitions. Forgetting things seemed, under the circumstances, almost reasonable. The phone call happened on a Wednesday morning in mid-September. I was sitting in the sunroom with my coffee, the house quiet, Sterling's car already gone from the drive. I called my attorney, not the estate attorney, who had handled Robert's trust, but a woman named Claire Ashworth, who had managed several of my publishing contracts over the years, and whom I trusted with the occasional personal matter. I wanted to ask about updating certain provisions of my will, routine maintenance, the kind of thing a 65-year-old woman does when she begins thinking more carefully about what she is leaving behind and to whom. The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. That evening, Sterling and I were reading in the sitting room when he set down his book and said conversationally, "Have you given any thought to what happens to the trust if something were to happen to you? The charitable provisions specifically." I looked at him over my reading glasses. He had named the exact provision I had discussed with Claire that morning. He used almost precisely the same language. I said, "Where did that come from?" He shrugged. "Just thinking ahead. We're not getting younger." I looked back at my book. I turned a page I did not read. And for the first time in 12 years, I let a question stay in my head rather than showing at the door. How does he know that? It stayed with me through the next 3 days, quiet, persistent, turning itself over, like a stone I kept expecting to find something under. I told myself there were explanations, that he had mentioned the trust to his financial advisor and the topic had simply been on his mind, that coincidences exist and do not always mean anything. But I had written 23 mystery novels. I knew what a coincidence looked like, and I knew what a clue looked like. They do not look the same. On a gray Thursday afternoon with rain coming in low off the bay, and Sterling away at a board meeting until evening, I sat at the kitchen table and made a decision that had been forming for 3 days without my permission. If I was right, I needed to know. And if I was wrong, well, I had been wrong before. I could survive being wrong again. 3 days after I found myself staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, I drove to the Mission District. I did not tell Sterling where I was going. I told him I had a hair appointment, the kind of mundane excuse that requires no elaboration when a marriage has already grown quiet in the wrong places. He barely looked up from his phone. Margaret's office was exactly what I had expected, and nothing like what I had hoped. No polished lobby, no receptionist with a headset, just a narrow hallway on the second floor of a building that smelled of old coffee and cheaper ambitions, and a frosted glass door with a small placard that read, MLR Consulting in plain black letters. The kind of place people come to when they don't want anyone to know they're looking for something. Before I reached for the handle, I stopped. The hearing aid. I had been wearing it so automatically these past weeks that I nearly forgot it was there. But standing in that hallway about to speak words I had never said aloud to anyone, something shifted. A reflex, perhaps. The same instinct that had kept my fictional detectives alive through 12 novels never carry anything into a sensitive room that you did not place there yourself. I reached up, removed the small device from behind my ear, and slipped it into my coat pocket. The silence that followed felt different. Cleaner. I knocked. A voice said, "It's open." Margaret Lawson was not what most people would picture when they imagined a private investigator. She was in her mid-50s, with platinum hair pulled back at the nape of her neck and wire-rimmed glasses that made her eyes look sharper than they probably needed to be. She wore a gray blazer over a cream blouse, a cup of black coffee at her elbow, and a notepad actual paper in front of her on the desk. No laptop open, no tablet. The desk itself was old walnut scuffed at the corners, covered in files, organized with the quiet precision of someone who trusted systems more than technology. She gestured to the chair across from her without standing up. "Mrs. Whitmore, sit down." I sat. "You drove yourself," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Anyone know you're here?" "No." She picked up her pen. "Then let's start from the beginning." I had rehearsed this in the car. I had written opening lines in my head the way I used to write first chapters, clean, precise, no unnecessary sentiment. But the moment I opened my mouth, something else came out. Not the polished version, the true one. I told her about the cameras, 7 of them installed the previous summer while I was visiting my sister in Portland. Sterling had explained them as a security upgrade. The neighborhood had seen a string of car thefts or so, he said. But when I noticed where the lenses pointed, something had snagged in my chest. Not toward the doors, not toward the windows, toward my writing desk, toward the corner of the room where the wall safe sat behind a landscape painting I had owned since before I met him. I told her about the hearing aid. A birthday gift presented at dinner slipped behind my ear by his own hands, while he smiled and said the audiologist had been very specific about the fit. I had worn it every day since August without a second thought, because the world had grown slightly softer and I had assumed it was simply age catching up with me. And I told her about the phone call. In early September, I had called Thomas Harrington, my real estate attorney, a man I had worked with for nearly 2 decades, to ask a quiet question about the trust structure surrounding the villa. Nothing formal, nothing filed. A private conversation between 2 people who had known each other long enough to speak plainly. 2 evenings later, Sterling mentioned casually over dinner, as though commenting on the weather, that he hoped the trust arrangements were still in good order. He used language I had never shared with him. Specific language. The kind that does not surface in ordinary conversation. I watched Margaret's pen move across the page without looking up. "How long before the camera installation did his behavior change?" she asked. "Gradually," I said. "Looking back 2 years? Maybe 3. Small things." "Did he ever ask directly about the value of the villa or the trust?" "Not directly. He asked adjacent questions. Renovation costs, market comparisons, whether I had updated the beneficiary designations." She wrote something down, circled it, and set the pen on the notepad. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I've worked cases like yours for 22 years. Different names, different cities, different asset structures. The pattern you're describing, the camera's angled wrong. The gift that listens the information that travels without a carrier, I've seen it before. She paused. I'm not saying your husband is guilty of anything. I'm saying your instincts brought you to the right place. She told me her plan in 3 stages. The first, she would have the hearing aid examined by a forensic technician she trusted, someone who had worked in federal telecommunications before going private. The process would take 2 weeks. The second, counter-surveillance. Her associate would conduct a quiet sweep of the villa for additional listening devices while Sterling was at work. The third, and this was the part I had not expected, a test. A staged meeting, Margaret said. A colleague of mine will pose as your private attorney. The two of you will have a conversation at the villa about updating your will, specifically a clause that benefits Sterling. If the hearing aid is a listening device, he will respond to that information within 48 hours. He won't be able to help himself. And my real attorney? I asked. You meet him separately, without the hearing aid, somewhere Sterling has no access to. She said it the way a chess player announces check, not triumphant, just certain. If the device is clean, the test tells us nothing and we move to other methods. If it isn't, then we know, I said. Then we know. I looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light through the frosted glass was the color of weak tea. Outside, the mission was making its usual noise, buses' voices, the faint melody of someone's radio drifting up from the street. What if I'm wrong? I asked. About all of it. Margaret picked up her coffee cup before answering. If you're wrong, she said, you lose a month of doubt and nothing else. If you're right, she set the cup down. You save everything. I nodded once. I signed the retainer agreement she slid across the desk, 2 pages, clear language, standard California PI contract. Then I stood, shook her hand, and walked back down that narrow hallway. The drive home took 40 minutes in the early evening drizzle. At the first red light on Valencia Street, I reached into my coat pocket and held the hearing aid up to the gray window light. Small, unremarkable. The casing the color of pale skin, designed to disappear. I set it back on the passenger seat and kept both hands on the wheel. I had spent 30 years writing characters who always knew when something was wrong, who trusted the cold feeling at the base of their spine, even when their minds offered perfectly reasonable explanations. I had always believed that instinct was a literary device, a convenience for plot. Sitting in that car watching the rain draw lines down the windshield, I realized I had been wrong about that too. The question was not whether I was right about Sterling. The question was what would remain once I found out. A week after sitting across from Margaret in that gray-lit office, I put the hearing aid back in my ear. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky over Pacific Heights was the color of old pewter, and the bay beyond the window sat flat and still under a low marine layer. I dressed carefully, a navy wrap dress, low heels. The kind of outfit that said routine appointment without announcing anything. I checked my reflection once in the hallway mirror the way a person does before stepping onto a stage. Sterling was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. He had his back to me, scrolling through something on his phone while the espresso machine finished its cycle. He didn't look up when I said I had a meeting with an attorney, a formality I told him about the property insurance on the villa. He nodded without turning around, said he'd be home for dinner. I drove to an address in the financial district that Margaret had texted me the night before. The office belonged to a man named David Whitfield, a colleague of Margaret's, a retired paralegal who had spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of work: staged consultations, controlled conversations, the quiet construction of evidence. He met me in the lobby wearing a charcoal suit and the unremarkable confidence of someone who had played many roles in many rooms. He shook my hand and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, shall we begin?" We sat across from each other at a round table in a borrowed conference room on the 14th floor. The city spread out behind him through floor-to-ceiling glass. He had a legal pad, a pen, a bottle of water. Everything in the room felt deliberately ordinary. For 35 minutes, I talked about my will. Specifically, I described a revision I had no intention of making, an amendment that would increase Sterling's share of the liquid assets by 40% in the event of my death within the next 18 months. I mentioned figures. I mentioned dates. I mentioned the name of the financial institution where the primary account was held. Every detail was fabricated, specific enough to be memorable, structured enough that someone listening would have no reason to doubt its authenticity. David Whitfield nodded along and took notes. He asked clarifying questions at the right moments. He was very good at his job. When I walked out into the financial district afternoon, the hearing aid sat behind my ear exactly where Sterling had placed it on my birthday. And I felt for the first time genuinely afraid not of what Sterling might do, but of how effortlessly I was learning to be someone I didn't recognize. I arrived home at 4:30. Sterling was already there, which surprised me. He usually stayed at the Whitmore Foundation offices until 6, sometimes later. But he was in the sitting room with 2 cups of tea on the low table, and he stood when I came through the door, as though he had been waiting for precisely this moment. "You look tired," he said. He handed me a cup. "Sit down." I sat. The tea was chamomile. My blend brewed correctly the way he had always known how I liked it. I wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth settle there. For several minutes we talked about nothing consequential. The Foundation's upcoming gala, a restaurant he wanted to try in Hayes Valley, whether the fog would clear by the weekend. He was relaxed, attentive, the version of Sterling that had made me believe 12 years ago that I had found something rare. Then gently, the way you turn a conversation rather than redirect it, he said, "I've been thinking we should revisit the estate documents, just to make sure everything is current. I know you've been meaning to." I looked at him over the rim of my cup. "It's not urgent," he added with a small smile. "But if you're already meeting with attorneys, it might be worth addressing while things are fresh." If you're already meeting with attorneys. He had not asked where I had been. He had not asked which attorney or about what or why today specifically. He had simply arrived at the subject, my will, my estate, the documents that governed what would happen to everything I owned, as though the idea had occurred to him independently in the natural course of an afternoon. I set my cup down on the saucer with a steadiness that surprised even me. "You're right," I said. "I'll look into scheduling something." He nodded, satisfied, and refilled my cup. I watched his hands on the teapot, unhurried, precise. The hands of a man who believed he was the only one in the room who understood the shape of the game being played. And something shifted behind my eyes. Not anger, not grief. Something quieter and more permanent than either. For 12 years I had looked at Sterling and seen my husband. A flawed man, certainly. Distant in ways I had attributed to temperament, to stress, to the particular sadness that accumulates in long marriages. But a husband. Sitting in that room watching him pour my tea, I saw him differently. Not the person who had walked beside me through a decade of ordinary life, but the performance of that person, careful, sustained, and entirely deliberate. The man I had married was a role, and I had been the audience. I finished the tea. I thanked him. I told him I was tired and would go up to rest before dinner. At the top of the stairs, I sat on the edge of the bed in the gray afternoon light and took out my phone. Margaret had told me to use 3 words if the test confirmed what we suspected. Nothing more. Nothing traceable to specifics. I typed them. "You were right." I sent the message and set the phone face down on the quilt. 2 days later, Margaret called. She asked me to come back to the office. What she told me when I arrived was heavier than anything I had prepared myself to carry. October arrived in San Francisco the way grief sometimes does, quietly and all at once. The fog that month was different from the usual marine layer that burned off by mid-morning. It settled in and stayed, turning the hills soft at the edges and the water beneath the bridge into something you could only sense rather than see. I had always loved October in this city. Standing at the kitchen window in the mornings, watching the fog move through the cypress trees below the estate, I used to feel a particular kind of peace that I couldn't name. That October, I felt nothing of the sort. Margaret had chosen the cafe carefully, a narrow place tucked between a bookshop and a dry cleaner on a side street that most tourists never found. We sat at the corner table, backs to the wall, facing the door. I had left the hearing aid in the drawer of my nightstand that morning, telling Sterling I had a dentist appointment downtown and didn't want to bother with it. He had nodded the way he always nodded, present enough to register the information, absent enough to file it away without interest. I ordered black coffee. Margaret ordered nothing. She set a manila envelope on the table between us. "I want you to understand something before you open that," she said. "Whatever is inside it is not your fault. I've been doing this work for 22 years and I have sat across from 100 women in chairs exactly like yours. The first thing they all ask themselves is what they missed, what they should have seen." She held my gaze. "You didn't miss anything." He was very careful. I looked at the envelope for a moment. Then I opened it. The report inside was 4 pages typed on the letterhead of a private forensic laboratory in Palo Alto. Margaret had explained when we first met that her counter-surveillance sweep of the villa had included a discreet collection of samples from the master bathroom. My supplement bottles, pulled by her associate during a routine access that I had quietly authorized. Under California law, I had every right to permit that access. What they were in my home and on my shelves belonged to me. The findings were precise and clinical, the language stripped of all drama. 3 of my daily supplements, the ones Sterling had begun ordering for me in early 2024. Insisting the brand was better than what I'd been taking, had been found to contain trace quantities of a synthetic compound associated with gradual cognitive impairment. Not a pharmaceutical, not something that would appear on a standard blood panel. The kind of compound, the report noted, that accumulates slowly, that mimics the ordinary fog of aging, that leaves a person wondering whether the forgetting is hers or something done to her. I set the paper down. I did not cry. I had spent enough years writing about the mechanics of betrayal to understand that the body sometimes processes shock before the mind catches up. My hands were steady on the table. My breathing was even. But somewhere behind my sternum, something that had been holding its shape for a very long time simply stopped. The headaches. The words that slipped away mid-sentence. The mornings I stood in the kitchen and couldn't remember why I had walked in. I had told myself it was 65. I had told myself it was stress or grief or the particular exhaustion of a long marriage that had grown quiet in the wrong places. I had believed that. I had believed it because Sterling had made it easy to believe. "I've had a physician I trust review the dosage levels," Margaret said. Her voice was level, informational, the way a surgeon explains a procedure. "Her assessment is that your current exposure, if stopped within the next week, carries no lasting neurological risk. The compound doesn't accumulate past a certain threshold. You haven't reached it." "She's certain as the data allows." "Yes." I looked up. "I don't want to stop." Margaret didn't blink. "I thought you might say that. If I change anything, the routine, the supplements, the way I behave at home, he'll know something has shifted. And if he knows, he'll move faster," she finished. "On the assets. On everything." She paused. "It's your call, Mrs. Whitmore. Legally and medically, I won't make it for you." I thought about Sterling at the kitchen counter that morning, his back to me, unhurried. The espresso machine cycling. The nod that required nothing of him. "A few more days," I said. Then I switched to my old supplements and tell him the new ones were upsetting my stomach. Something ordinary. Something he won't question. Margaret wrote something on her notepad. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and set something else on the table. Not an envelope this time. A small stack of photographs printed on matte paper, the edges clean. "These came from Julian," she said. He forwarded them through a secure channel 2 days ago. His PI had been tracking Bianca's movements when she made contact with a third party. She pushed the photographs toward me. That third party was not Bianca. I picked up the first photograph. A bar in Hayes Valley exposed brick, low lighting, the kind of place that was neither quiet enough for privacy nor loud enough for cover. The timestamp in the corner read, September 14th, 8:47 p.m. Sterling sat on one side of the booth, his jacket off, his posture relaxed. Across from him, leaning slightly forward with a glass of white wine between her hands, was my daughter. Vivienne. I looked at the second photograph. September 21st. The same bar. The same booth. The third. October 3rd. A different location. A wine bar in the marina I recognized from a neighborhood newsletter. Sterling and Vivienne again, this time standing near the entrance. Close enough that their conversation required no effort over the ambient noise. In every photograph, Vivienne was smiling. Julian also passed along a partial transcript from a call between Bianca and an unidentified contact. Margaret said quietly. In it, Bianca mentions something Sterling keeps in the fish tank. She describes it as insurance. She let the words settle on the table between us. Whatever is in that tank, Sterling put it there, and he and Bianca both know what it contains. I set the photographs down with the same steadiness I had used to set down my teacup 6 evenings ago in my own sitting room. I looked at my daughter's face in those images, the particular tilt of her chin when she was engaged in a conversation that mattered to her, a habit she'd had since childhood. I had spent 30 years learning the vocabulary of her expressions, knowing the difference between the smile she wore to be polite and the one that meant she was genuinely present with someone. In those photographs, she was genuinely present. I searched her face the way I had once searched the faces of characters I'd written, who were hiding something, looking for the tightness around the eyes that signaled reluctance, the angle of the shoulders that suggested coercion. I was looking for evidence that she had been pressured, that she had been cornered by a man skilled at identifying vulnerability and had simply not known how to refuse. I did not find it. What I found instead was something I had no chapter for, no framework to contain. In the days that followed, I stopped sleeping in the room I shared with Sterling. I told him my back was bothering me and that the mattress in the guest room was firmer. He accepted this without comment, the way he accepted most things I said now, with a nod that was less acknowledgement than filing. I moved a few things down the hall: a pillow, a cardigan, the novel I had been pretending to read for the past 3 weeks. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Sterling I had made my peace with. Not forgiveness, something colder and more useful than forgiveness. Understanding. I had spent 12 years writing villains, and I understood now that the most effective ones don't announce themselves. They arrive carrying gifts. They learn your preferences before you've thought to protect them. They make you feel, for a long and comfortable stretch of time, that you are finally being truly seen, and by the time you realize what they were actually looking for, you have already handed them the map. But Vivienne was not a villain I had written. She was someone I had raised. I lay in the dark and tried to build the story the way I used to build stories. Start with what you know, then follow the logic to what you don't. What did I know about my daughter? I knew she was 34 years old. I knew she had her father's eyes, my first husband's eyes, the pale gray of early morning fog, even though she shared none of his blood. Vivienne was my daughter from a relationship that had ended before it had properly begun. A brief and poorly considered chapter of my early 30s that had nonetheless produced the most significant person in my life. When I married Edward Hargrove in 2001, he had adopted Vivienne without hesitation, without conditions, without ever making her feel the weight of the distinction. She called him Dad. He called her his. And then, in 2012, Edward died. The will was his to write, and he had written it carefully with the help of Thomas Harrington and 2 weeks of deliberate thought. He left the villa, The investment accounts and the entirety of the trust $15 million to me. Not to Vivienne, not split, not conditional, not partially held in reserve. I had sat in Thomas's office and listened to those provisions read aloud, and I had understood immediately what Edward intended. He trusted me to provide for Vivienne as I saw fit in my own time, in my own way. It was not a slight against her. It was confidence in me. I had never explained this to Vivienne. That was the silence. That was the wound I had left untended for 12 years, assuming that she understood. Assuming that the relationship between a mother and daughter who had built a life together could absorb the unspoken without damage. I was wrong about that. She had never said so directly. That was the particular quality of Vivienne's pain. It didn't announce itself. She didn't confront, didn't accuse, didn't lay the grievance out in terms that could be addressed. She simply grew quieter at certain moments. Arrived at the holidays with a brightness that felt slightly effortful. Changed the subject when money came up with a smoothness that I had mistaken for maturity. Sterling, I now understood, had not mistaken it at all. I didn't know exactly what he had said to her. I hadn't been in that Hayes Valley bar booth, hadn't heard the first conversation or the second or the third. But I knew Sterling's methods well enough by now to reconstruct the shape of it. He would not have opened with money. He was too careful for that. He would have opened with something that felt like being understood. Your mother doesn't realize how much that will affect you. She means well, but sometimes the people closest to us can't see what's right in front of them. Something like that. Gentle. Observational. The kind of statement that requires the listener to correct it or confirm it, and either way draws them closer. And Vivienne, who had spent 12 years translating her grief into competence, who had built a life on her own terms, partly because she'd had to, who carried the particular exhaustion of a person who has never been able to say the true thing to the person who most needs to hear it, Vivienne would have felt, sitting across from Sterling in that dim bar, something she had probably stopped expecting. Relief. He had offered her a story in which she was not wrong to feel what she felt, in which her mother's silence had been a kind of abandonment, and her own resentment was not a character flaw, but a reasonable response to an unreasonable circumstance. And then carefully, over weeks, he had offered her a role in a solution. I did not know how much of the plan she had been told. I wanted to believe she didn't know about the compound in the supplement bottles. I wanted to believe Sterling had described it differently, a mild sedative, something to soften me at the edges, something to make me easier to guide. Not poison, not the slow erosion of a mind. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative that my daughter had knowingly watched me forget my own sentences across the dinner table and said nothing, was not something I could hold and remain functional. So I chose not to hold it yet. I set it aside the way you set a heavy object down when you need both hands for something else. Sitting on the edge of that guest bed at 2:30 in the morning, I understood something I had not understood before. Sterling had not simply identified a greedy daughter and recruited her. He had found a wound that I had created through love, through assumption, through 12 years of silence, that I had called trust, and he had walked straight through it. The betrayal was his. But the door had been mine to leave open. I sat with that until the fog outside the window began to soften from black to gray. Then I stood up. Not because I had resolved anything, and not because the ache in my chest had diminished by a single degree. I stood up because I had spent 30 years writing women who survived the unsurvivable, and I understood, in a way that was almost impersonal, that grief was not an argument against action. There was a great deal still to be done before Saturday. There is a rule I learned in 30 years of writing crime fiction, one that every detective in every novel I ever published understood. Before the story ended, the guilty do not confess. They are caught. And to catch them, you need a trap precise enough that they walk into it believing it was their own idea. I had spent my career building those traps on paper. In October, I began building one in real life. The first piece was the portrait. I had not painted in years. Sterling had quietly discouraged that too, along with the writing, along with most things that occupied my attention independent of him. But I knew people who did. Margaret put me in contact with a painter named Daniel Forsyth, a figurative artist who worked out of a studio in Soma, a neighborhood of converted warehouses south of Market Street, where the light came in hard and gray through industrial skylights, and nobody asked questions about commission timelines. Forsyth was 60, unhurried, and had painted portraits for clients who required discretion before. He asked me to sit for 2 sessions and said the canvas would be finished within 3 weeks. I told him I needed it in 2. He looked at me for a moment over his reading glasses. Then he said, "All right." The portrait was large, nearly 6 feet tall, mounted in a wide gilt frame that I had sourced from an estate sale in Marin County. It showed me seated in a dark blue dress, with my hands folded in my lap and my eyes looking slightly past the viewer. Forsyth had captured something in the expression that I hadn't asked for, and couldn't entirely name a quality of attention, as though the subject knew something the room did not. When I saw it finished, I thought it was the most honest image of me that had ever existed. The second piece was the sound system. Margaret had worked previously with a man named Colin Reyes, a former broadcast technician who had spent 15 years in live event production before going freelance. She brought him to the villa on a Wednesday morning when Sterling was at the foundation offices. Colin examined the portrait's frame for 20 minutes, asked 3 practical questions, and told me what was possible. The frame could accommodate 2 compact directional microphones positioned at the upper corners, angled toward the space immediately in front of the canvas. Those microphones could feed wirelessly to a receiver connected to the villa's existing speaker system, the same system Sterling had installed the previous year for his fundraising events. Any audio captured within a 6-foot radius of the portrait could be played back through the main ballroom speakers in real time. "It'll have a 2-second delay," Colin said. "You'll need someone at the receiver to activate playback manually." "That's fine," I said. "I'll have someone there." He looked at the portrait again. "Nice painting." "Thank you." "She looks like she already knows how it ends." I didn't respond to that, but I thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The third piece was the expert. Margaret had contacted a woman named Dr. Patricia Holt, an independent art authentication specialist based in Berkeley, who had worked with the FBI's art crime team on 3 separate cases involving forged paintings used for asset concealment. Dr. Holt had been quietly examining the $2 million abstract canvas that Sterling intended to auction at the Whitmore Foundation Gala since mid-October. Her preliminary report, delivered to Margaret in the first week of November, was unambiguous. The work was not by the artist whose name appeared on the certificate of authenticity. The provenance documentation had been fabricated. The painting was, in the language of the report, a high-quality forgery produced within the last 18 months. Under federal law, using a forged artwork in a charitable auction to move money through legitimate channels constituted both wire fraud and money laundering. Dr. Holt had dealt with U.S. attorneys before. She knew what the paperwork needed to look like. She agreed to attend the gala as a guest registered under her own name, with her authentication report in a sealed envelope in her bag. The fourth piece was the warrant. Margaret had been building the evidentiary file since September, the forensic lab report on the supplements, the surveillance photographs of Sterling and Vivienne, the phone transcripts referencing the fish tank Collins' technical assessment of the hearing aid. She presented the complete package to a contact at the San Francisco Police Department in the last week of October. The SFPD liaised with the FBI field office on Bryant Street. Given the international wire transfer element, the Geneva accounts fell under federal jurisdiction. The search warrant was signed by a federal magistrate on the morning of Saturday, November 16th. Officers would be positioned 2 blocks from the estate by 7 that evening. They would wait for Margaret's signal. The fifth piece was the invitation. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was Sterling's event. He had organized it, promoted it, sold the tables at $15,000 each, 400 guests, press coverage. The kind of evening that generated goodwill and tax receipts in equal measure. I was the co-host. My name was on the invitation. My portrait would be the centerpiece of the auction. And on the night when the moment was right, a member of the serving staff someone Margaret had arranged would approach Sterling with a quiet message. A significant donor wished to speak with him privately about a major contribution. The donor was standing near the portrait. Sterling would go. He would not be able to help himself. A major donor on the night of his most visible event requesting a private conversation. For a man who had spent 12 years managing appearances, that was not an opportunity. That was an obligation. Whatever he said in that conversation, whatever passed between him and Bianca in those minutes near the portrait, would carry across every speaker in the room. I stood in my study on the first Thursday of November and looked at the layout I had sketched on paper. The portrait's position in the ballroom, the speaker locations, the officers' entry points, the sequence of revelations. I had written endings like this before, the moment when every thread pulled taut at once, when the architecture of a careful plan revealed itself to the people who had believed they were watching an ordinary evening. For the first time in many months, I felt like myself. Not Eleanor Whitmore Sterling's wife, not the woman with the softening memory and the careful smile and the chamomile tea waiting on the low table. Eleanor Hargrove, the one who knew how stories worked, the one who had always known how to end them. There was one thing left to do before Saturday, the most important piece of all, the one that everything else depended on. Without it, the portrait and the warrant and the authentication report were theater. Effective theater, perhaps, but theater without consequence. This last piece required a different kind of appointment entirely. The Thursday before the gala, I woke at 5:30. Not from anxiety. I had moved past anxiety somewhere in the third week of October. The way you move past a landmark on a long drive and stop watching for it in the rearview mirror. What woke me was something closer to clarity. The particular alertness of a person who has finished preparing and is simply waiting for the work to begin. I dressed in the dark. A gray wool suit, low-heeled boots, the kind of outfit that said professional appointment to anyone who might ask, and nothing at all to anyone who wouldn't. Sterling was still asleep when I came downstairs. I left the hearing aid on the kitchen counter, visible, unremarkable, exactly where a woman who wore one habitually might leave it before an early errand. Then I picked up my keys and walked out to the car. The city was still wet from an overnight rain. Market Street was quiet at that hour, the storefronts dark, the cable car tracks gleaming under the early lights. I drove down to the financial district with the radio off and the windows cracked, letting in the smell of eucalyptus and damp concrete that is particular to San Francisco mornings in November. By the time I reached Battery Street, the sky had shifted from black to a deep, uncertain gray. Arthur Pembroke's office was on the 11th floor of a building 3 blocks from the Embarcadero. I had known Arthur for 21 years, since before Edward, since the early days when I was a novelist with modest savings and no particular reason to need an estate attorney, and he was a junior partner in a firm that handled the kind of quiet, meticulous work that wealthy families preferred to keep invisible. He had drafted Edward's will. He had walked me through the probate process in 2012. He was the only attorney in San Francisco whose name had never once passed my lips while the hearing aid was in my ear. He was waiting for me when I stepped off the elevator. 70 years old, silver-haired, with the careful posture of a man who had spent decades delivering difficult information in a calm voice. He shook my hand and led me into his office without preliminary small talk. Arthur had never been a man for small talk. "Everything is prepared," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "I want to walk you through it once before you sign." "Please," I said. He opened the folder on his desk. The document was a revocable living trust established under California probate code. In plain terms, a legal structure that would hold the $15 million and the villa, and the investment accounts and every other asset I had inherited from Edward under my own management, with the protections of a formal trust, rather than the vulnerabilities of individual ownership. As grantor, I retained full control. I could amend the trust, revoke it, or restructure it at any point during my lifetime. My name appeared as both the grantor and the primary beneficiary. Nothing would change in my daily life. I would still live in the villa, still access the accounts, still make every decision about how the assets were managed. The difference was, what would happen if someone tried to touch those assets without my consent? Under the trust structure, Arthur said, any attempt to transfer, encumber, or access these assets without your written authorization triggers an automatic legal hold. The assets cannot move. A challenge would require a court proceeding which would be public, documented, and extremely difficult to win against a properly established trust. And Julian Mercer as co-trustee? I asked. Arthur nodded. Mr. Mercer's role is precisely defined. He has no independent authority over the assets during your lifetime. His authority activates only upon your written instruction, or in the event of your incapacitation, and incapacitation requires formal medical certification, not a subjective determination. He paused. He cannot act unilaterally. He can only act with you or for you in circumstances where you are demonstrably unable to act for yourself. I thought about that for a moment. The precision of it. The way the language closed every door. And the separate property question, I said. Arthur removed a second document from the folder, a supporting memorandum he had prepared alongside the trust. The $15 million represents assets inherited from your first husband's estate in 2012, he said. They have been maintained in accounts held exclusively in your name since that date. There has been no commingling, no transfer of inherited funds into joint accounts, no use of those funds for jointly held expenses, no documentation that could reasonably suggest a shared interest. He set the memorandum on the desk between us. Under California Family Code Section 770, these assets are your separate property. Your current husband has no legal claim to them, not in a divorce proceeding, not in a civil action, not in any scenario I can construct. He's going to try, I said. He's welcome to. Arthur's voice was entirely even. He will not succeed. I looked at the documents on the desk. 12 years of a life that had grown, incrementally and almost imperceptibly, into something I didn't recognize, reduced now to the question of a signature. 2 signatures, in fact, on 2 separate lines at the bottom of a trust declaration that would make the next 48 hours a great deal safer than they would otherwise have been. I picked up the pen. Arthur witnessed. His assistant called in from the outer office, witnessed the second signature. The notary stamp went on last, a small, unremarkable impression on the lower corner of the page that meant in the language of California law that this document existed and could not be undone by anyone other than me. I sat for a moment after it was finished, looking out through Arthur's window at the financial district coming to life 11 floors below. Delivery trucks navigating the one-way streets. Commuters moving along the sidewalks in the gray morning light, collars turned up against the November chill. Somewhere among those buildings, Sterling was probably finishing his coffee, reviewing the gala's seating arrangement, making sure the auction catalog was ready, doing what he always did, performing the role of a man with nothing to hide, because he had spent years in the comfortable certainty that no one was looking carefully enough to see through it. I recapped the pen and set it on the desk. The trust was signed, the warrant was issued, the portrait was hung, the expert was briefed, the officers were on standby. Every piece of the architecture was in place. I thanked Arthur, and shook his hand. "Will you be all right?" he asked quietly, the way people ask when they mean something larger than the immediate moment. "Yes," I said, and I meant it in the way I hadn't meant anything in a long time. I drove home through the financial district morning with the windows still cracked, the air still cool and damp, the bay visible in brief glimpses between the buildings. Sterling was in the kitchen when I came through the door. Dressed now, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up. "Early errand," he said. "Gift shopping," I said. "For Saturday. I wanted to find something for the volunteers." He smiled, the warm, practiced smile that had once made me feel known. "That's thoughtful," he said. "Very you." I smiled back. Set my bag on the counter. Reached for the coffee pot. 48 hours. The woman in the mirror looked exactly as she was supposed to. Navy silk floor length. Pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. Hair set at the salon that afternoon. Swept back in a style I had worn to every foundation event for the past decade. A face composed into the expression that 12 years of practice had made effortless, present gracious, entirely untroubled. I studied her for a long moment. Then I reached for the hearing aid on the vanity and I put it in. Not because I had forgotten what it was. Not because the past 2 months had slipped away and left me credulous again. I put it in because tonight, for the first time, the advantage had reversed. Sterling had spent months listening to me through this device. My phone calls, my private thoughts, spoken aloud, the quiet negotiations I had made with the world while believing I was alone. Tonight, I would wear it as the person I had always been, someone who understood how a story was constructed and who knew exactly which scene this was. Let him hear whatever he wanted to hear. I picked up my evening bag, small navy with the phone inside already set to silent, and walked out of the bedroom without looking at the mirror again. Downstairs, the villa had become something else entirely. The Foundation's event team had been working since noon. Every surface that could hold a flower held one white peony's eucalyptus, stems of something pale and structural whose name I couldn't recall. The chandeliers in the main ballroom had been fitted with warmer bulbs for the evening, casting the room in a light that was flattering in the way expensive things often are. It made everything look slightly better than it actually was. Guests had begun arriving at 7. By 7:30, the main floor held perhaps 100 people, tech executives from Soma Foundation, board members from Pacific Heights and Marine, a cluster of city officials near the bar, a documentary filmmaker I recognized from a charity board I had served on 3 years prior. Sterling moved through the room with the ease of someone who had been rehearsing this particular performance for years. He found me near the entrance to the ballroom at 7:45. "You look beautiful," he said. His hand came to the small of my back, the familiar weight of it. The gesture I had once read as affection and now understood as positioning. He was placing me where he needed me to be. "Thank you," I said. "The room looks wonderful. The catalog sold out. Every table." His voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as expected. "This is going to be an extraordinary evening." I smiled at him the way I had smiled at him for 12 years, warmly, without reservation, with nothing visible behind it at all. For the next hour, I stood beside him and did what I had always done at these events. Listened well, spoke when addressed, remembered the names of people I had met only twice, asked questions about children and recent travel that made people feel seen. Sterling introduced me to 3 couples I hadn't met before: donors from Seattle, a foundation partner from Los Angeles, a surgeon and his wife who had recently relocated from Boston. I shook every hand. I meant none of it and showed none of that. At 8:15, I excused myself to refresh my drink. It was at the far end of the bar, near the archway that separated the main ballroom from the gallery corridor, that I saw her. She was sitting in a low-backed chair against the east wall, one of the smaller chairs that had been arranged for guests who wanted to observe rather than circulate. Mid-50s, wearing a charcoal dress that was elegant without being conspicuous. Her hair was a warm chestnut, styled simply. She held a glass of sparkling water in both hands and was doing what I recognized, from long habit, as the specific work of watching a room without appearing to watch it. She had been doing this for 22 years. She was very good at it. Our eyes met for exactly 1 second, long enough to register, brief enough that no one around us would have noticed. She gave the smallest possible nod, the kind that could be mistaken for adjusting her posture, and then her gaze moved on to the painting on the wall beside her. I turned back to the bar and ordered another champagne I didn't intend to finish. At 8:30, Bianca arrived. I knew it without turning around. I had been watching the entrance reflected in the decorative mirror behind the bar, a detail Sterling had never thought to consider when he arranged the room. The slight shift in ambient noise, the movement near the door, and then Sterling's hand lifting from the bar where it had rested. A gesture so small it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. I turned. Bianca Calloway was younger than I had expected, even knowing her age. 29 or 30, the kind of youth that reads as effortlessness in a room full of people who had worked hard to appear as if they hadn't. She wore a dress the color of good wine, cut simply, with the ease of someone whose confidence came from somewhere other than the mirror. Her violin case hung from her left hand, dark leather against the red. She moved through the room without looking for anyone, and then she found Sterling's eyes across the width of the ballroom. And something passed between them that lasted less than a second and said everything. I had written that moment in a novel once. The specific recognition of two people who share a secret in a crowded room. I had believed when I wrote it that I was inventing something. Sterling crossed to her. I watched him take her free hand and say something close to her ear, the way a host greets a featured performer professional, warm, unremarkable to anyone not keeping score. He gestured toward the small stage at the far end of the room where her music stand had been set up. She smiled at whatever he said. I took a slow sip of champagne. At 8:40, Sterling appeared at my elbow again, following the circuit back to me that I had come to understand as routine maintenance, the regular reassurance that the wife was in place and the evening was proceeding correctly. "She's extraordinary," he said, nodding toward Bianca, who was opening her case near the stage. "Wait until you hear her play." "I'm looking forward to it," I said. He leaned slightly closer. His voice dropped half a register, the intimate register, the one he deployed when he wanted something to feel like confidence. "Tonight is going to be perfect," he said. "Everything has come together exactly right." I looked at him, really looked the way I had learned to look at the end of a long investigation, when the facts had been assembled and only the conclusion remained. "You're right," I said. "It has." He smiled, touched my arm briefly, and moved on to greet another arriving guest. Across the room, Bianca lifted her bow. The first note of the massinet filled the ballroom, the same piece she had played in my imagination since that first evening at the auction. The same piece I had heard described in the reviews Sterling had forwarded to me in September, calling her the most compelling young violinist working in the Bay Area today. It moved through the room the way beautiful things do when they are in service of something ugly cleanly without apology, asking nothing of the listener except attention. I looked at my watch. 8:47. I took one more sip of champagne, set the glass on a passing tray, and let the music wash over me the way cold water does, clarifying without comfort. 73 minutes. I told Sterling I needed my medication. It was the simplest lie I had told in months, simpler even than gift shopping, and it required nothing from him except a nod, which was all he gave me. He was standing near the fireplace with a glass of bourbon and a conversation I had no interest in interrupting. Bianca was 3 feet to his left, speaking with a woman from the foundation board, her violin case deposited somewhere out of sight. Neither of them watched me go. I climbed the stairs at the pace of someone who had done so 10,000 times. The second floor was quiet, the way houses are quiet when the party is happening somewhere below, a muffled thrum of conversation, the distant tink of glassware. Debussy playing softly through the speaker system that Colin had calibrated earlier that week. Up here, those sounds arrived as suggestion rather than fact. I moved past the master bedroom. Past the linen closet, past the framed architectural drawings Sterling had hung in the hallway, because he believed they communicated something about his taste. I pushed open the door to his study. The room was dark except for the tank. Sterling's aquarium ran 6 feet along the east wall, a custom saltwater installation he had commissioned 2 years into our marriage, at a cost I had never asked about because it had never seemed important. He maintained it himself obsessively with the focused attention he rarely gave anything else in the house: Moorish idols, clownfish, a small, slow-moving creature in the far corner that the marine specialist had called a dragonette. The water was lit from below by LEDs calibrated to mimic the quality of shallow reef light, blue-green cold, the color of something very far from the surface. I crossed the room without turning on the lights. The glow from the tank was enough. It caught the edges of the furniture, the face of the mahogany desk. The row of reference books Sterling kept aligned with the precision of a person who used organization as a form of control. I stood at the tank's edge and looked into the water for a moment. The fish moved without urgency. The sand at the bottom was pale and undisturbed. It would not remain that way. I pushed back my right sleeve. The silk of the dress was going to be a problem, and I accepted this without particular emotion and slid my hand into the water. The cold was immediate and total. Not the gradual cold of adjusting, but the sudden cold of commitment, the kind that clarifies rather than numbs. The water closed over my wrist and then my forearm as I reached deeper, angling toward the far left corner where Julian had said and where the transcript had implied, and where something in my own mind, the part that had spent 30 years understanding how a man like Sterling would think, had confirmed. The sand shifted around my fingers. Fine and loose at the surface, denser underneath, with the specific resistance of material that had been disturbed and resettled more than once. I moved my hand slowly, methodically, the way I moved through a manuscript when I was looking for the place where the logic had gone wrong. My fingertips touched something that was not sand, metal, flat, approximately the size of a deck of cards with squared edges and a surface that was smooth except for one side, which had the faint texture of a magnetic seal. I closed my hand around it and pulled. The box came up trailing sand and water dark against my palm, entirely unremarkable in appearance, the kind of object you could hold in a crowded room and attract no attention. I set it on the edge of the desk and examined the magnetic closure for a moment. Then I pressed the release point at the lower corner, the way the latch was designed to open, and the lid came free without resistance. Inside a small silica gel packet, slightly damp from proximity but intact. Beneath it, sealed in a thin plastic sleeve, a micro SD card no larger than my thumbnail. I sat down at Sterling's desk. His laptop was closed but not locked. I had known his password for 11 years, a combination of the Foundation's founding year and a word I had once thought was sentimental. I opened the machine, waited for the screen to wake, and inserted the card into the reader port on the left side. One file, video, 42 minutes long. I pressed play. The footage was interior. A room I didn't recognize. Neutral walls, 2 chairs angled toward each other. The camera was fixed, positioned slightly high and to the left the way a security camera sits, rather than a deliberate recording. Sterling was on the right. Vivienne was on the left. She was wearing the gray cardigan I had given her for her birthday 2 years ago. I watched the footage without sound for the first several seconds, because some part of me was still engaged in the mechanical tasks adjusting the volume, ensuring the screen brightness was low enough not to throw light under the study door, confirming the timestamp in the corner. September 21st. The same evening as the second photograph Margaret had shown me in the October Café. The same night. The same conversation from the other side of the camera. I turned the volume up. Their voices were clear and unhurried. Sterling was explaining something logistics timelines. The ordinary language of planning, and Vivienne was listening with the focused attention I recognized from her childhood. When she was learning something new and did not want to ask the question twice. Then she said it. How long before the medication takes full effect? Sterling didn't hesitate. A few more months, but she's already signing things incorrectly. A brief pause. She signed a check last week with your grandfather's name. Vivian said nothing for a moment. Then, she won't remember this conversation. She doesn't remember much of September, Sterling said. By spring, we won't need to have this conversation at all. I closed the laptop. The tank hummed beside me in the dark. The fish continued their slow, indifferent circuits. The silica packet sat on the desk next to the open box next to the SD card, next to the sleeve of my dress that was still damp to the elbow. I sat with what I had just heard for exactly 3 minutes. Not because I needed time to understand it, I had understood it before the video ended. But because understanding something completely and being ready to act on it are two different conditions. And I had learned over a long career of writing people who confused one for the other, that the distance between them mattered. Then I reached up and removed the hearing aid from behind my ear. I set it on the desk beside the tank, not in my pocket, not in my bag. On the desk, in Sterling's room, pointed toward the door. Still on. I took the SD card. I closed the waterproof box and left it where I had placed it. I walked to the adjoining bathroom, ran cold water over my forearm until the sensation returned fully, and smoothed my sleeve as best I could. I checked my reflection in the mirror above the sink. Composed, present, unhurried. I turned off the bathroom light, walked back through the dark study, and stepped out into the hallway. From below, the sound of the party rose to meet me, laughter. The soft percussion of 100 conversations, the distant announcement that the auction preview was now open in the gallery. I descended the stairs at the same pace I had climbed them. It was time. Everything Eleanor planned, every quiet move, every document signed, every trap set, it all leads to this moment. Before I take you there, drop "ready" in the comments. I want to know who's still standing with her. Just so you know, elements of this story are fictional, shaped for entertainment, and to carry a message worth hearing if you'd rather not continue. This is a perfectly good place to stop. Downstairs, the laughter was still going. That was the thing about a room full of people who believed an evening was proceeding correctly. It had its own momentum, its own ambient confidence. The auction preview had drawn the crowd into the gallery corridor, champagne in hand, catalog pages turning. The chandeliers cast everything in their forgiving warmth. The Debussy had given way to something quieter, more ambient, the kind of music chosen precisely because it required nothing of the listener. I stepped off the last stair and back into all of it. No one turned. No one noticed the slight dampness at my right sleeve, or the particular quality of stillness that I carried down from the second floor with me. I moved through the perimeter of the room with the measured ease of a co-host making her rounds, pausing to acknowledge a couple near the bar, accepting a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, exchanging a sentence or two with the foundation board member who had been trying to speak with me since 7:30. I was looking for two things. The first was Margaret. I found her where I had left her, the low-backed chair against the east wall, her sparkling water replaced now with a cup of something warm, her attention directed at the gallery entrance with the patient focus of a person who had been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time. I did not approach her. I did not need to. When our eyes met across the room, I gave the smallest possible movement of my head downward once and watched her set her cup on the side table and reach into her evening bag. The second was the serving staff. A young man in a white jacket was moving through the room with a tray of petit fours. I intercepted him near the corridor entrance and spoke quietly, so that the words carried no further than his ear. He nodded, adjusted his tray, and moved toward the fireplace where Sterling was holding court with the Seattle donors. I positioned myself at the center of the room, and I waited. Sterling received the message at 10:03. I watched him from across the room, watched the almost imperceptible shift in his posture when the server leaned close, the brief recalibration behind his eyes as he processed the information. A major donor, a private conversation. Near the portrait, For a man who had spent the last several months architecting the precise transfer of $15 million, the news of a significant new contribution was not something he could defer to tomorrow. That was the thing about greed that functioned at Sterling's level. It had no patience for inconvenience. Every opportunity was urgent. Every door had to be opened immediately, before someone else reached it first. He excused himself from the Seattle donors with a smile and a touch on the arm that promised he'd return shortly. He found Bianca at the edge of the gallery corridor and said something to her in the half-second passing motion of two people who had rehearsed this kind of communication until it required no effort. She set down her glass. She followed him. They moved together toward the far end of the ballroom, where Forsyth's portrait hung on the east wall, under a pair of directed gallery lights. The painting I had commissioned and approved and arranged to be hung exactly there in that exact position. 6 feet from the nearest speaker, I watched them arrive at the portrait. Sterling scanned the immediate area. He checked left, then right, then glanced back toward the crowd. His expression was controlled but readable. To someone who had been reading it for 12 years, mild confusion shading toward the particular irritation of a man who had rearranged his evening for something that wasn't materializing. Bianca stepped closer to him. She spoke first, her voice low, her lips barely moving, the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to conversations that were not meant to be overheard. What she didn't know was that the portrait was listening. The microphones, 2 of them embedded in the upper corners of the gilt frame, angled precisely toward the space where a person would naturally stand when viewing a large canvas, were directional, sensitive, and feeding in real time to the wireless receiver that Margaret had just activated from across the room. The 2-second delay Colin had warned me about was the only gap between what was spoken and what would be heard. Sterling replied to Bianca. His voice was lower than hers, quieter, more controlled, but the directional microphones were not interested in effort. They captured what was in range, at whatever volume it arrived. The speakers carried it to the room. The first sound that came through was ambient, a breath, the faint shift of fabric, and then Bianca's voice, clear and unhurried, filling the ballroom from 6 directions simultaneously. "There's no one here." A few heads turned. More in curiosity than alarm, a voice from the speakers unexpectedly distinct. Perhaps a technical issue with the evening's audio, perhaps something from the presentation. Then Sterling's voice. "After tonight, we won't need to worry. Everything is already done." The room's momentum faltered. The specific silence of a crowd that has collectively understood something it did not expect to understand, not all at once, not with immediate clarity, but with the dawning and particular discomfort of people who have just heard something they cannot unhear. Bianca again. "What about her?" A pause. Sterling's voice calm, assured, carrying the tone of a man who had considered every variable. "She won't be able to do anything about it." Complete silence. 400 people in a ballroom and not one sound. Then the whispers started, soft at first, the way fire starts at the edge rather than the center, then spreading outward through the room with its own gathering speed. I watched Sterling's face in the moment he understood. Watched the processing happen in real time, the sound of his own voice from the speakers, the silence of the crowd. The particular species of recognition that arrives when a trap closes and you realize you were the one who walked into it. He turned. He scanned the room. His eyes moved across the crowd with the controlled urgency of a man looking for a specific face. One face, the only face that could explain what was happening. He found me at the center of the ballroom. I was holding the event microphone, the one the Foundation's AV team had left, on the small podium near the stage, for the auction announcements. I had picked it up 30 seconds ago, while Sterling was still making his way toward the portrait. It was warm in my hand. Lighter than I had expected. I looked at my husband across the room. He looked at me. 12 years of dinners and Foundation events and mornings in the same kitchen and evenings in the same house. 12 years of the specific intimacy of people who have learned each other's habits and silences and preferences, all of it compressed into this single moment of mutual recognition. I smiled at him. Not the smile I had worn for 12 years. Something different. Something I had not needed to use in a very long time. He took one step forward, then stopped. Because across the room, the woman in the charcoal dress had risen from her low-backed chair and was moving toward the main entrance with the calm purpose of someone who had a call to make. I turned toward the stage. I did not hurry. I did not hesitate. Each step was the step of a person who had written this moment before she lived it, who had built it piece by piece over the course of weeks, and who understood with the absolute certainty of a completed manuscript that what came next belonged entirely to her. I stepped up onto the low platform, raised the microphone, and began. There are moments you don't prepare for because without knowing it, you have been preparing for them your entire life. I had spent 30 years writing women who stood in impossible rooms and said the necessary thing. Women who had been diminished and dismissed and quietly erased and who found, at the hinge of their stories, the particular courage that is not the absence of fear, but the decision that fear is no longer the most important thing in the room. I had written them. I had believed in them. Standing on that stage with a microphone in my hand and 400 people looking up at me, I finally understood that I had also been practicing to become one. I did not raise my voice. I never raised my voice. After 30 years of writing, I have learned that the quietest sentence in a room is always the one that carries furthest. "Good evening," I said. "I'm Eleanor Hargrove. Some of you know me as Sterling Whitmore's wife. I'd like to take a few minutes of your time before we proceed with the auction. I want to make sure everyone in this room has the full picture of what the Whitmore Foundation has been doing with your generosity." A pause. Clean and deliberate. Beginning with this. I looked to the back of the room where the Foundation's AV technician, briefed by Margaret 3 days ago, and compensated for his discretion, brought the main presentation screen to life. The footage was the same I had watched 40 minutes earlier in the dark of Sterling's study. But in a ballroom on a screen 12 feet wide with 400 people watching in real time. The September 21st video carried a different weight entirely. Sterling's voice, Vivienne's voice, the unhurried conversation of two people who believed they were alone, discussing the timeline of a medication designed to erode the mind of a 65-year-old woman until she could no longer manage her own affairs. How long before the medication takes full effect? A few more months, but she's already signing things incorrectly. I did not watch the screen. I watched the room. I watched the faces of the Seattle donors, the Foundation board members, the surgeon from Boston, the documentary filmmaker I had met 3 years ago at a charity gala, not unlike this one. I watched the specific sequence of human expression that moves from confusion to comprehension to the particular stillness that arrives when a person understands that something terrible has been happening in a place they considered respectable. After the medication footage, the screen shifted. The next set of documents was financial, the Whitmore Foundation's internal transfer records compiled by Julian and the forensic accountant Margaret had retained in September. The numbers were specific and annotated the routing of charitable donations through a series of intermediary accounts. The final destination, a private banking arrangement in Geneva registered under a name that did not appear in any Foundation documentation. 3 years of structured transfers. $4 million in total moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic flagging, but large enough across the full period to constitute a systematic and deliberate fraud. The room remained silent. From the east wall, a figure rose from a low-backed chair. Margaret Lawson crossed the room with the same unhurried purpose I had watched her apply to every task since September. She stopped at the edge of the stage and faced the crowd. Not me, the crowd, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular authority of someone who has spent 2 decades in rooms where the truth was inconvenient. "My name is Margaret Lawson. I hold a California licensed private investigator credential number PI28847. Over the past 8 weeks, I have conducted a lawful investigation into the financial and personal conduct of Sterling Whitmore at the request of his wife, Eleanor Hargrove. All evidence you are seeing tonight has been collected through legal means and has been submitted in full to the San Francisco Police Department and the FBI field office on Bryant Street. A federal search warrant covering the Whitmore Foundation accounts and the personal finances of Sterling Whitmore was issued by a federal magistrate this morning. She paused. The officers are already here. As if on cue, because it was in fact precisely on cue, the main entrance doors opened. 2 SFPD officers entered first, followed by 2 individuals in plain clothes whose bearing and the particular way they scanned the room identified them without introduction. They did not rush. They moved to the side of the room and established their positions waiting. Before the crowd had fully processed this, a second figure rose from the audience. Dr. Patricia Holt was 62 years old with the academic posture of someone who had testified in federal court and found the experience unremarkable. She smoothed her jacket, and addressed the room in the clear, measured register of an expert witness. I am Dr. Patricia Holt, an independent art authentication specialist. I have worked with the FBI art crime team on 3 previous cases involving fraudulent artworks used for asset concealment. The painting currently featured as the centerpiece of tonight's auction, attributed to the artist Raymond Callister and valued in the catalog at $2 million, is a forgery. She held up the sealed envelope she had been carrying since she arrived. This report documents my findings in full. The work was produced within the last 18 months. The provenance documentation is fabricated. The artist whose name appears on the certificate of authenticity did not create this piece. She set the report on the edge of the stage. The work was produced by Bianca Calloway. At the name, every head in the room turned. Bianca was standing near the gallery corridor, 15 feet from the portrait, her violin case at her feet. She did not move. She did not speak. The particular stillness of a person calculating the remaining options and finding none of them acceptable. Sterling had not moved either. He was standing where I had last seen him, center left of the room near the fireplace, with the careful composure of a man who was still, even now, attempting to manage the situation. His expression had not broken into anything readable. He was performing control the way he had performed everything else for 12 years, and he was doing it well. But Julian was already moving. Julian Mercer crossed from the gallery corridor to the 2 plainclothes officers with the efficient purposefulness of a lawyer who had been waiting for this specific moment since October. He handed them a sealed folder, the offshore banking records, the wire transfer documentation, the complete paper trail from the foundation accounts to the Geneva arrangement. He said something quietly to the officer nearest him. The officer opened the folder, reviewed the first page, and nodded. I looked at Sterling from the stage. I had rehearsed this sentence. Not the words, those had always been clear, but the register, the tone, the absence of triumph, and the presence of something more permanent. "Sterling," I said. The microphone carried it to every corner of the room. He looked up at me. "You are attending a funeral tonight, not mine." I held his gaze across the full width of the ballroom. "Yours." He opened his mouth. I don't know what he intended to say. I suspect he didn't know either, because for the first time in 12 years, Sterling Whitmore was in a room where the script was not his. The officer stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a federal warrant for your arrest." Sterling turned toward the officer the way a man turns toward bad weather, slowly, with the residual dignity of someone who refuses to be seen flinching. He said something I couldn't hear from the stage. The officer responded. Sterling said something else. The second officer moved to his other side. Julian spoke quietly to the plainclothes agents. One of them crossed the room to Bianca and spoke to her in the same low, professional register. She set down her violin case. She did not look at Sterling. I watched the two SFPD officers walk my husband of 12 years across the ballroom, past the champagne trays and the white peonies and the catalog of artworks that would not be auctioned tonight, and through the main entrance doors. 400 people watched in complete silence. And then I remembered. The hearing aid. Sterling's desk. Still on. Everything it had recorded in that upstairs room since I placed it there. Every conversation, every instruction, every arrangement made in the 40 minutes between my departure and the arrival of the officers was still running. There was one final piece of evidence that no one in this room knew about. No one except me. I set the microphone back on the podium. I left the podium without ceremony. The room behind me was still processing voices rising again, not in the festive register of an hour ago, but in the urgent, fractured way of people trying to reconcile what they had just seen with what they had believed when they arrived. I didn't look back. I had said what needed to be said. The rest belonged to other people now. At the foot of the stairs, I stopped one of the SFPD officers, a man named Daniel Marsh, who had introduced himself briefly to Margaret before the evening began. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with the settled patience of someone who had worked enough cases to stop being surprised by the directions they took. "There's something upstairs," I said. "I need you to see it." He followed me without question. Julian joined us at the second-floor landing he had been watching for exactly this moment, the way he had been watching for every other moment in this evening's sequence. He fell into step beside me without needing to be told what we were doing, or why. The door to Sterling's study was exactly as I had left it. The room was dark except for the aquarium, the same blue-green light that had guided my hands through the sand an hour ago, still casting its underwater glow across the desk, the shelves, the carefully aligned reference books. Officer Marsh moved his flashlight across the room in a slow professional arc before I reached for the light switch. The hearing aid was on the desk, exactly where I had placed it, small, silver-cased, sitting 3 inches from the edge of the waterproof box I had left open beside it, the empty compartment still bearing the faint impression of the micro SD card it had held for however many months Sterling had needed it there. Officer Marsh crouched to examine it without touching it. "This is the device?" he asked. "Yes. My husband gave it to me as a birthday gift in August. A private forensic laboratory in Palo Alto confirmed it contained a secondary function, a listening component that transmitted audio to a third-party receiver." I kept my voice even. "I placed it here at 9:30 this evening before I came downstairs. I left it on." Marsh looked up at me. "On?" he repeated. "On," I confirmed. Julian stepped forward. He had his reading glasses on, the ones he wore when he was about to be precise about something. "Before you handle the device," he said to Marsh, "I want to address the evidentiary question because it's going to come up, and it's better to establish it now." He paused the way lawyers pause before a statement they've rehearsed not for effect, but for accuracy. California Penal Code, Section 632 prohibits the recording of confidential communications without all-party consent. That's the governing statute. Mrs. Hargrove did not obtain Sterling Whitmore's consent before placing this device in this room. Marsh nodded slowly. "Meaning the audio isn't admissible directly as a standalone exhibit in a criminal proceeding, correct? There are arguments available. The first is that Mr. Whitmore installed this listening device himself. He cannot reasonably claim a privacy interest in a recording made by his own equipment in a property he does not own. Courts have applied estoppel principles in analogous cases." Julian removed his glasses. "But I wouldn't want to stake the prosecution on that argument alone. What I'm more interested in is what the device actually recorded, because that determines how useful it is." He crossed to the desk and produced a small external speaker from his jacket pocket, the kind used for listening to audio from a phone. He connected it to a digital recorder he had evidently been carrying, which was itself connected via a short cable to the hearing aid's output port. I had not known he was going to do this. He pressed play. The first 20 minutes of audio were ambient. the muffled sounds of the party downstairs, the faint percussion of 100 conversations filtered through floor and plaster. Nothing distinguishable. Marsh stood with his hands clasped behind his back and waited with the same patience he had probably applied to 1,000 evidential reviews. Then Sterling's voice, unmistakable, close. He had been in this room. The timestamp on Julian's recorder read 9:41 p.m. 11 minutes after I had left. Sterling was on the phone. One side of the conversation the way you hear when someone is speaking in a room you're not supposed to be in. His voice was low and rapid, the compressed efficiency of a man managing a timeline. Everything is on schedule. She doesn't suspect anything. After the gala, we leave. The car is arranged. The flight is at 1. Don't be late. A brief pause. Then, the accounts are accessible from Geneva as of Monday. We don't need anything else from here. Another pause longer. She won't be a problem by spring. That part was always going to take time. The recording continued, but Julian stopped playback there. The room was very quiet. Officer Marsh stood still for a moment, looking at the hearing aid on the desk with an expression that had settled into professional assessment. Then he reached for his radio. "This is Marsh. I need the evidence tech up to the second floor study and confirm with the AUSA that we have additional audio consistent with flight risk." He released the radio. "Flight scheduled for 1 a.m. That's probable cause for a no-bail recommendation." He looked at me. "Mrs. Hargrove, the device. Where is it exactly relative to where Mr. Whitmore was standing when he made that call?" "On the desk," I said. "He would have been standing at the desk. He always makes calls standing at the desk, and the desk is in Mrs. Hargrove's property," Julian said quietly. The biometric ownership of this estate was confirmed as separate property of Eleanor Hargrove under a revocable living trust executed Thursday morning. Mr. Whitmore had no ownership interest in this property. His expectation of privacy in a room he did not own while using a device he himself installed is a question the prosecution will be glad to put before a judge. Marsh looked at Julian for a moment. Then he nodded, once the nod of a man who understood that certain conversations belonged in a courtroom and not in a study at 10:30 on a Saturday night. I picked up the hearing aid. I turned it over in my palm, once this small, unremarkable thing that had changed everything it touched. A birthday gift presented at dinner, placed behind my ear by a man who had been measuring the distance between me and my own thoughts for months. I set it in Officer Marsh's open hand. "Sterling's gift to me," I said. "I think it belongs somewhere else now." Marsh sealed it in an evidence bag. He wrote on the label. He handed me a receipt. Julian walked to the window and looked out at the street below, the red and blue of the patrol vehicles parked 2 blocks down, still visible from the second floor. He said nothing for a moment, then quietly, "It's done, Eleanor." I looked at the aquarium. The fish moved without concern through their blue-lit water, the sand undisturbed again. The small corner where the waterproof box had rested for however many months, looking no different from any other part of the tank's pale bottom. I turned off the desk lamp and walked to the door. Downstairs, the sounds of departure had begun, voices at the entrance, the murmur of valet arrangements, the particular thinning of a party that has ended in a way no one anticipated. I stood in the hallway and let the sounds of the house settle around me. The house that had always been mine. I put my hand on the stair railing. There was one person I had not spoken to tonight. One person whose face I had been carrying since October, whose voice I had heard on a video 45 minutes ago, calm, curious, asking how long it would take. One person whose grief I understood, and whose choices I did not, and with whom I had 12 years of silence to finally break. She was the reason I had not slept properly in 3 weeks. She was not Sterling. She was harder than Sterling. She was my daughter. The last car pulled away from the estate at 11:53. I watched from the upstairs window until the taillights disappeared around the corner of the street. And then I stood in the hallway for a long moment listening to what a house sounds like when it has been emptied of everything that was filling it. Not peace, not relief, something more like the silence between a door closing and whatever comes next. Vivian was still downstairs. I had known she would be. The same way I had known as a writer that a story does not end at the arrest, that the most difficult scene is always the one that happens after the crowd has gone home, when there are only two people left in the room and no performance left to give. I came down the stairs and into the living room. She was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, the one she had claimed as hers since childhood whenever she visited. The particular chair whose position she had always adjusted slightly to face the window rather than the room. She did not look up when I entered. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was still wearing the dress she had arrived in. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for a while. The fireplace held only cold ash. The flowers the event team had arranged that morning were still on every surface, white peonies already beginning to close for the night. The eucalyptus releasing its sharp, clean scent into the room. Somewhere below us, the catering staff had finished their quiet restoration of the kitchen and left through the service entrance. Finally, Vivienne spoke. He came to me 2 years ago. Her voice was low and careful, the way it gets when she is deciding in real time how much of the truth she can bear to say. He told me things I already knew, that I had never, that the will had never. She stopped. Started again. He said you didn't realize how much it had affected me, that you loved me, but you didn't see it. I let her continue. He said the medication would just slow things down, make you need help with decisions. He said it wasn't dangerous, that it would give us time to make sure everything was arranged properly. She looked at her hands. He said it was better than going through lawyers, better than a conversation that would only hurt you. He made it sound like a long pause, like I was protecting you from something harder. I watched her face while she spoke. The particular set of her jaw that she had carried since her 20s, that defensive downward angle that appeared whenever she was asking to be believed. I had written characters with that expression. I knew what it meant. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Did you ask him why? She looked up briefly, then away. Did you ask him why it had to be medication? Why you couldn't just come to me? Sit in this room in that chair and tell me what you've been carrying for 12 years. The silence that followed was the answer, not because she hadn't thought to ask, but because asking would have required hearing the answer, and the answer that there was no justification, that the medication was not protection, but calculation, that Sterling had not offered her a solution to a wound, but a use for one, was the answer she had not been willing to receive. She had not asked because she had not wanted to know. I sat with that for a moment. Then I stood. When your grandfather died, I said, he left everything to me. Not because he didn't love you, because he trusted me to take care of you in whatever way was right, in whatever time was right. I believe that was enough that you would understand without my having to explain it. I paused. I was wrong about that. I should have sat down with you years ago and said exactly what I just told you. That was my failure, Vivienne. I own it. She was very still. What you did after that, the choices you made with what Sterling told you, the questions you didn't ask, because you preferred not to, those belong to you. I'm not going to tell you what they mean tonight. I don't think either of us knows yet what they mean. I picked up my evening bag from the side table where I had left it before the party began. A lifetime ago. You don't have to answer me tonight. But at some point, not for me, not for the lawyers, not for whatever comes next in court, you're going to need to answer yourself. Vivienne looked up. For the first time since I had entered the room, she looked directly at me. I had been watching for remorse, the specific softness around the eyes that means a person has located their own wrongdoing and is genuinely grieved by it. I had written remorse enough times to recognize it. What I saw instead was something different. something that arrives not when a person regrets what they've done, but when they finally completely understand what they've done. Recognition without the insulation of denial, the understanding landing fully without anywhere left to put it. It was not softer than remorse. It was considerably harder. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I walked to the living room door. "The guest room is made up," I said. "If you need it." I stepped into the hallway. Behind me, the living room was quiet. She would have to find her own way through what was left. The same way I had found mine, not in a single evening, not with an audience, but in the slow and private work of deciding who you are after the worst thing has happened. I had been doing that work for years. Tonight, hers was beginning. The weeks that followed did not feel like victory. I had expected relief, the clean, expansive kind that arrives when something long and difficult is finally over. What came instead was emptiness. The specific emptiness of a room that has been cleared of furniture, nothing broken, nothing missing, only the marks on the hardwood floor where something heavy had stood for a very long time. I will say this briefly because the legal proceedings deserve accuracy and nothing more. Sterling was charged with financial elder abuse conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud across 3 jurisdictions, and money laundering through the deliberate use of forged artwork. The charges carried in aggregate a sentence that would outlast any plan he had made for the years ahead. Bianca cooperated with the federal prosecutor in exchange for a reduced charge she understood correctly, that the alternative was worse. The Whitmore Foundation was placed in receivership and subsequently dissolved. The $15 million remained exactly where I had put it, in a trust bearing my name belonging entirely to me. All of this happened. I read about it in documents and heard it in phone calls from Julian, and I absorbed it the way you absorb information about weather in a country you've already left. What occupied me in those weeks was something else. I began spending my evenings in my study. Not working, not at first. Simply sitting. I pulled old novels from the shelves, my own books, the ones I had written in the years before Sterling. When the work had come from somewhere, I no longer felt certain I could locate. I read passages I barely remembered writing. I tried to find in the cadence of those sentences the person who had composed them. She had known things I had forgotten. She had trusted her own attention. She had believed without needing anyone to confirm it that what she noticed about the world was worth putting down. Sterling had not taken that from me in a single conversation. He had taken it the way you take a language from someone, gradually through small, consistent corrections, until the speaker begins to hesitate before every word. Are you sure that's the right term? That chapter feels uneven, don't you think? Your last book didn't do as well. Maybe this style isn't working for you anymore. Each sentence, reasonable. Each sentence in isolation, a kindness. Together over years, a wall. The worst part, the part I sat with longest in those quiet evenings, was not what he had said. It was that I had begun to believe him. Not all at once, not consciously, but in the way that water finds a crack slowly, invisibly, until the damage is structural. I had started writing shorter sentences, then shorter chapters, then longer gaps between drafts. And somewhere in the middle of those years, I had arrived at the conclusion that perhaps he was right. Perhaps the clarity I had once felt at a blank page was a younger woman's confidence, and what I was experiencing now was simply the truth of my own limitations. That was what Sterling had wanted most. Not the money, though he had wanted that too methodically and without apology, but the money was a practical goal. What he wanted from me, the thing he had worked the longest to achieve, was my belief in my own diminishment. Because a woman who doubts her own mind is much easier to manage than one who trusts it. One evening in December, I opened my laptop. The screen came up white. I sat in front of it for 15 minutes without touching the keyboard. Not because I didn't know what to write, because I was waiting to feel afraid, waiting for the familiar hesitation, the small internal voice that had learned over 12 years to ask a permission before proceeding. The voice didn't come. I placed my hands on the keys. They did not tremble. I had believed he had taken my writing from me, but sitting in that room in the house that had always been mine with the fog outside the window and the quiet of an estate that was finally completely my own, I understood something I should have known long before. Stories do not leave the people who carry them. Only the people sometimes leave themselves. I began to type. The first thing I wrote was not an opening line. It was not a chapter heading or a character's name or a plot point I had been circling for months. It was a question one I had carried for 12 years without ever allowing myself to form it into language. I wrote it in full. I did not delete it. For the first time in longer than I could precisely remember, no one was going to tell me to. That Christmas, I did not decorate a tree. I did not prepare dinner for two. I did not set a second place at the table, or buy a gift for someone who would unwrap it with the practiced warmth of a person performing gratitude. I did not stand at the door in the evening wondering what time to expect anyone home. I made coffee at 7 in the morning, carried it to the window, and watched San Francisco exist beneath its fog. It was the first Christmas in 12 years that I could breathe fully all the way down. The fog that morning was the particular kind that settles over Pacific Heights in late December, soft and total, erasing the bay and the bridges and the hills across the water, leaving only the immediate world, the cypress trees on the slope below the estate, the gray-white sky, the city going quietly about the business of a holiday morning. I had always loved this view. I had forgotten somewhere in the middle of those 12 years that it was mine. I thought about the people who had passed through this story. Margaret had closed her file in November and sent me a brief note, professional spare, the kind of correspondence she was evidently constitutionally incapable of making sentimental. Case concluded. If you need anything further, you know where the office is. I had smiled reading it. I still did. Julian had done what he set out to do. I understood with the clarity that distance provides, that his motives had never been uncomplicated. He had come to me at that auction because Bianca's exposure served his own legal interests as much as mine, and because a man like Julian Mercer does not act from pure altruism when calculated alignment is available. But he had done the right thing at the right time, and in my experience, that is worth acknowledging regardless of the motive behind it. Vivienne. I did not let myself stay with her name for long, not because the grief was too sharp, but because grief without direction is only whether it happens to you, and you wait for it to change. What I was doing with Vivienne was something slower and more deliberate than grief. I had written her a letter in December, 4 pages handwritten. The kind of letter I should have written 12 years ago and didn't. She had not responded yet. I did not know if she would. The door between us was open by an inch or by a mile, and I would not know which until one of us walked through it. I was prepared for the first time to wait without controlling the outcome. The novel had no title yet. I had written 40 pages since December began, more than I had produced in any single month in the previous 4 years. The pages were rough and honest and structurally imperfect, and more alive than anything I had written since before I understood what I had been slowly losing. I did not know exactly what the book was about in the way that early drafts rarely reveal their own architecture. I knew only that it was truer than anything I had previously published, and that this truth was the reason it was difficult, and also the reason it mattered. Sterling had tried to make me believe that my best work was behind me, that the voice I had trusted for 30 years was an artifact of youth rather than a quality of attention. He had done this carefully over time, the way a careful person does lasting damage, not in a single blow, but in the accumulated pressure of 100 small redirections, until the person being redirected can no longer locate her own original course. What I had rediscovered in those December evenings at my desk was that the voice had never gone anywhere. It had been here the entire time in the same place. Stories always wait, just below the noise of everything else, patient ready, indifferent to how long it had been ignored. I turned from the window. Someone would ask eventually, a journalist perhaps, or a well-meaning friend or a reader who had followed the story as it made its way through the news cycles and legal proceedings. Do you have any regrets? I had an answer ready. Not the careful answer, not the polished one, but the true one, which is the only kind worth giving at 65. I regret that I did not see it sooner. I spent years adjusting to a version of my life that was being quietly, deliberately narrowed, and I mistook the adjustment for wisdom. I was not foolish. I was trusting, which is a different thing, though the results can look similar from the outside. But I do not regret seeing it when I did. I do not regret the months of fear and the careful work, and the nights of not sleeping, and the morning I sat in Margaret's gray-lit office and said the things I had never said aloud to anyone. I do not regret standing on that stage with a microphone in my hand and saying what needed to be said in front of everyone who had believed the performance. 65. People speak of it as a looking-back age, a stock-taking age, an age for consolidation and gentle decline. I have found it to be the age at which I finally stopped asking permission. I carried my coffee back to the desk. The manuscript was open on the screen page 41 mid-sentence waiting where I had left it the night before. The morning light through the window was thin and silver, the fog pressing gently at the glass, the cypress trees below perfectly still. I sat down. I read the last sentence I had written, and without hesitation, without pausing to ask whether it was good enough, whether it was the right direction, whether someone else would approve, I continued. This is a family drama story about silence, the kind that costs you everything if you keep it too long. I stayed quiet for 12 years. Don't be like me. Trust what you notice. Trust what feels wrong. The truth will set you free. I used to think that was comfort. Now I know it's a warning. In every family drama story, the most dangerous moment isn't the betrayal. It's the silence you keep before admitting it's real. The family revenge stories that stay with you aren't about burning everything down. They're about a woman who stood up quietly and said the thing that could not be unsaid. That's what I did. In the family revenge stories I've lived, real revenge means refusing to be diminished. Nothing more, nothing less. And in every family drama story worth telling, the person who wins is simply the one who finally stops asking permission. The best family revenge stories don't end in destruction. They end in reclamation. If this story moved, you share it. Leave a comment. Stay for what comes next. You already know how. Thank you for staying until the very last word. Stories ahead may contain fictional elements for educational purposes. If this isn't for you, no hard feelings. Choose what's right for you.
Thanks for watching all the way thought. I really appreciate you being here. I will see you in the next story.